More of a discussion than anything else, but very, very excited to be back at IWP. I was actually enrolled in this graduate program during my work years here in DC from 2005 until 2011, and so what was pretty unique was that I was able to sort of do graduate work in politics, although international politics, but also work in domestic politics, and so I was able to sort of come in with examples and problems of the real world that I was seeing out there and facing, but then also taking the lessons learned from IWP, from the classes and the professors that I worked with. And here at IWP, you'll find some of the best strategists and tacticians and ideas people, not only in terms of foreign policy and statecraft and national security, but also just in terms of the reality of politics. One of the things that was most attractive to me about IWP when I was an undergrad at the University of Texas was the curriculum and the professors. It's a very unique institution made up of scholar practitioners. So I had this issue in my undergrad days where so many of my professors hadn't had real world experience in politics or in foreign policy or any other field. It was all sort of undergrad to graduate school to PhD. So here at IWP, you don't have that at all. It's a lot of folks who have real world experience and are scholar practitioners, which I found to be one of the most compelling reasons to enroll here at IWP. So as Charles said a little bit about me, I actually grew up in Texas. I went to the University of Texas in Austin and graduated in 2004, excuse me. Came to Washington in 2005 and started working for Freedom Works, which is a national grassroots organization with now over 4 million members. But as I got to DC, the organization was actually a little smaller, and we were fighting against kind of the zeitgeist of the day, which was big government. In 2008, we saw Republicans and Democrats come together to bail out the elite on Wall Street. It was sort of a bipartisan bailout that millions of Americans rejected. So regardless of your political philosophy, from where I sat, someone who was sort of more interested in limited government than big government, we were looking at both political parties failing us in that regard. And what we did is we were in the right place at the right time with the right message and the right ways to get people involved. And so we actually grew our organization using online petitions, using engagement in the grassroots to identify people who were upset at what was going on in the country and wanted to do something about it. This is the rise of the Tea Party movement in fall of 2008, early 2009. You see President Obama, along with President Bush, candidate John McCain before that, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, a bipartisan coalition of folks who were all sort of moving us in the same direction. And so again, what we saw was really that there were millions of Americans out there that were not happy with that action of the bailout. And then when President Obama came into office and he started pushing another $1 trillion spending package, the outrage out there was palpable. And so we acted fairly quickly and again used petitions and used some tools and tactics, I guess, that we've been trying for years and didn't have quite the momentum out there yet, but this was the right moment. And so this movement was born in February of 2009. And it grew tremendously throughout the year. I won't get into as many of the organizing tactics in the history because I really want to talk more about our strategic communications. But as this movement grew, it became a mass movement. Well, one of the most important things that we had to do was figure out how to keep it moving on the right path, to be influential, to be impactful, and to build a broad coalition of people. And so our communication strategy, in addition to our grassroots strategy, was really to appeal to a broad segment of the population. And what I found is that when we focused on two things, two policies that we opposed, the bailout and the stimulus, and just boiled it down to too much government too much government that we couldn't afford, we were able to appeal to people across the spectrum. There was actually a time in 2009 where we had something like 15% of Democrats supporting the Tea Party movement, a majority of independents, and a vast majority of Republicans. And I think that fact it has a lot to do with the fact that we focused on fiscal issues. We focused on those issues in particular because that's where the American people were. You had a lot of people who were not politically active at that time. You had people who were just upset and wanted an outlet to get involved. And so certainly we had a political philosophy that was probably a little bit more free market or limited government or even libertarian than a lot of the folks that were out there. But we knew that we couldn't necessarily lead with everything we wanted to get done right away. We knew that we had to build a broad coalition, and so we kept it focused on that. In terms of our communications, we had some challenges. As we grew in 2009, we had both political parties upset at us. The Republicans were mad because we were criticizing President Bush for bailing out Wall Street. We were criticizing John McCain for signing on to that. We were criticizing the Bush administration for its spending policies going back to 2005 and 2006. So the Republicans said, you're going to push us too far to the right. The Democrats, on the other hand, weren't, the Democratic establishment, I should say, just like the Republican establishment, weren't too happy either. They said that we were extreme, and we were really just mad that we had the first African-American president. And so they ascribed our action and our beliefs on horrible motives, which were untrue. So the challenge we really faced was one of taking on the political order and the political class in Washington, D.C. in particular. We had our motives questioned, and we didn't have a lot of support among that group, but we did have a lot of support out there among the broader electorate, among people who were mad at both parties. So I think that one of the things we really focused on was to show that we were nonpartisan, or at least bipartisan. And again, we did that through TV interviews, radio, the internet. We did that in a way to kind of show, look, we are upset at both parties. We'll give you examples of things where we disagree with what the Republicans have done on spending. We'll tell you why we disagree with President Obama's stimulus program. But that was necessary to have the credibility with so many millions of people that felt that way. And then they trusted us enough to say, you know what, I'll come to a Tea Party rally. I talked about focusing on fiscal issues. There were a lot of folks who wanted to sort of make this about other issues. And in this movement, you certainly had a mostly kind of conservative-minded, fiscal conservative Democrats, libertarians. You had kind of a coalition out there. But there were organizations and individuals who wanted to make it about other issues. There were pro-life people who wanted to make it about abortion. There were people who were for traditional marriage who wanted to make it about that issue. There were people that wanted to make it about the rise of Islamism around the world and in the United States. And we said, look, for this movement to succeed and for you to have more success with the issues you care about, we really need to keep it broadly focused on these issue sets. And so some disagree with that, and they would kind of try and steer the Tea Party a little bit more towards some of these other issues. But for that time and place, we felt like this was the way to build the broadest coalition. In fact, one of my colleagues remarked after the 2010 elections, he said, Brendan, we elected the most pro-life Congress in history. And most of the congressmen who got elected didn't lead with that issue. They didn't talk about it as much. They got a lot of support from voters who were pro-life Democrats or moderates or independents. Republicans carried the day and won 63 House seats, 6 Senate seats. But if you go back and look at what they talked about and what they focused on, it was fiscal issues. It was the role of government. And so as a social conservative myself and someone who's very pro-life, I knew that strategically we had to stay focused on these other issues. And I think that our success really speaks volumes how we did in 2010. I mentioned earlier sort of the challenge about our motives. During 2009, you had media commentators, mostly on the left, who said, this is all about people that are mad that there's an African-American president. So it was sort of these horrible charges of racism and bigotry. And we saw some of this coming, and so as we were organizing what became known as the 9/12 Taxpayer March on Washington, we got ahead of that issue. And there were actually quite a few folks who identified themselves and said, hey, I want to come speak at this rally. This rally happened on September 12th, 2009. It was the largest taxpayer protest in our country's history. 500,000 people or more showed up at the Capitol that day. And knowing that this would be one of the charges that was leveled against us, I think we had about 35 to 40 citizen speakers that day and a handful of elected officials. And knowing that this was a charge that was out there, a charge that was coming, out of that group, there was a disproportionate number of African-American Tea Party speakers who went up on the stage. It was a conscious effort on our part to say, how dare you charge us with that? In fact, a lot of the leaders, a lot of the people that are speaking today, you cannot deny the fact that these folks feel the way that we feel. These folks can be the face of this movement. That was a powerful symbol and a powerful way to kind of shatter that myth. And so the NAACP backed off a little bit with some of their questioning about that, but others continued that farce. Others said that the Tea Party was, we got attacked for being either the movement of the super elite or, racist rednecks. There were people who actually called us all these things in between, so we're accused of everything. But, we talked about being a movement that would appeal to drinkers of Miller Lite and Merlot. It didn't matter your race, your religion, your socioeconomic status. We really wanted to appeal to a cross-section of people, and we did. If you actually looked at the numbers in 2009 and 2010, the Tea Party movement was a little bit slightly higher income, a little bit slightly higher, more highly educated than the voting population at large, and a little bit older. And that was fine, but we definitely projected an image, and we definitely showed off the people that were younger, the diversity that we did have in our movement, whether it was socioeconomics, whether it was race, religion, or whatever. So one of my favorite stories, I guess, about our strategic communications approach was when David Schuster on MSNBC, he called up our office and said, "Hey, we want to have someone come on and defend the Tea Party against charges of racism. This has been out there, and we really want you to explain why you're not." And so I said, "Okay, well, we thought about that and said, who can we send up there to do this interview on TV?" So we went with someone whose last name was Borelli, good Italian name, and she was a Tea Party activist, a fiery speaker, a leader, and we send her on MSNBC. Of course, she's sitting there in her chair getting ready as these TV interviews go. David Schuster's wherever he's at in his studio, looking at his notes, getting ready to rip this person a new, just getting ready and foaming at the mouth, and he kind of does his lead and says, "So, Deneen Borelli, what do you have to say about charges of racism in the Tea Party?" And it cuts to her, and she's an African-American woman sitting there with a big smile on her face, ready to just take on the attack and show the absurdity of Schuster and his questioning. And she said, "Well, David, my personal experience has been that it's been very friendly. It's been very ecumenical. It's been a movement that's embraced me and people like me." And so she really just did a fantastic job knocking that down. And I think that shows the power of just simple choices like that. Who you put out there as your messenger. Certainly what their message is matters a lot. But it's pretty hard to make that argument against Deneen. And we probably tricked him a little bit with that good Italian name. There were all sorts of other attacks that we faced, that the movement was just made up of a bunch of angry people who were going into congressional offices and threatening people. And there were some angry folks who showed up at town hall meetings in 2009. They were mad about Obamacare in particular, and they showed up, and congressmen were not used to hearing from their constituents in that way. They were not used to seeing people at their town hall meetings. But we felt like it was really important when we got media interviews, when we had people go out and speak, that we showed a calm demeanor, that we were friendly. I did the Diane Rehm show on NPR. If you listen to that, it's a very calm, sort of slow-moving show. And of course, when I did that interview, I used my NPR voice. "Hi, this is Brendan. I'm really happy to be here on NPR. It's great to be with you, Diane. Really looking forward to the conversation about the Tea Party movement." And it just kind of knocked down a lot of these charges to the best of our ability. I did the Colbert Report on Comedy Central, and it was the hardest interview that I've ever done. And and he was trying to sort of take me to the far edge, and say absurd things. And I really just smiled and did my best to keep it focused and to not say anything that would get us in trouble. But I think having either myself or other people like me, young people who were involved in the movement, be the face of this, to have Deneen be the face of this, to have folks who didn't fit that attack, to proactively do that, I think was really important, and really, I think we had a lot of success with that. So it sort of went from attack to attack to attack. And at the end of the day, I guess they probably did land some punches on us. We did see some of the polling start to show that in time that the movement was losing support among Democrats and independents, and then even among some Republicans. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But for a long time, especially 2009 and 2010, we were able to build this mass movement that focused on fiscal issues. It was, almost anybody can say, "I'm for balancing the budget, and we have to get our debt under control." I mean, almost any Democrat, Republican, Independent can say that they're for that. Now, when you get into the details, it does start to divide people a little bit, but that's why you sort of start there, keep it focused there, and then we can have some of these other discussions and debates among ourselves. But if you can get hundreds of thousands of people to show up and protest or rally or get involved in elections and campaigns with some basic values that they agree upon, you can be very influential. A couple of fun examples of a couple of my favorite politicians who didn't get the memo. Gary Johnson, the former New Mexico governor. Well, love the guy, the best libertarian governor that we've ever had in this country, but did not understand this. We talked to Governor Johnson and said, you're going to go in front of a huge crowd, and they are with you on these issues of fiscal responsibility. Talk about what you did in New Mexico. Talk about vetoing bad public policy. Talk about limited government, but please do not go into your position on the drug war. Some people are with you. Just don't go into that right now, because if you want to get support for your ideas and what you're doing, you're going to lose at least half the crowd. And he kind of nods and agrees to that, I guess. But 10 minutes later, walks right on the stage. There's a huge crowd at the Capitol, and he says his name, former governor of New Mexico. One of the issues that I care the most about is we have to end the drug war. And of course, half the crowd boos. The older part of the crowd kind of boos, and the younger crowd is sitting there cheering and waving him on, but we just kind of shook our heads. But just a guy who just didn't understand the public relations side of that sometimes you have to sort of keep that in your back pocket until you get that credibility with people, and then you can kind of quietly make that argument. But he lost half the crowd, and they let him know about it. The other one was my former congressman, one of my favorite politicians as well, Representative Ron Paul. He went up to a rally in D.C., here in D.C., in April of 2010 at the Washington Monument. Again, a huge crowd. And we said, again, Congressman, focus on fiscal issues, talk about auditing the Fed, talk about all these other things, but we're not sure that your foreign policy views necessarily jive with everyone here. So I would steer clear of that for this rally, for this particular day. And he kind of, again, gave me that same nod that Gary Johnson gave, goes out there and proceeds to talk about how we need to end the Iraq war, bring the troops home, get them out of Afghanistan. We're in too many places, and he kind of, went on his riff there. And again, the older part of the crowd, generally kind of boos, and the younger crowd sort of cheers. The more libertarian-minded folks kind of cheer. The more conservative crowd, jeers a little bit. So they just didn't quite get the traction that other folks did that were able to kind of walk that line in a way that was effective. And so I think there's a lesson there in that you have to kind of know your audience, and you have to kind of know what you can focus on that will build that broadest coalition. And then when it comes down to it, if you wanted to have that conversation, again, within our family, quietly, or there's an opportunity to make a move incrementally on public policy, let's do that. But I think that it really just kind of drove a little bit of a wedge in our movement. So I think, just in terms of just the overall strategic view of things, you've got to find a policy set. I mean, to really build a mass movement, it's always easier to do it, frankly, when you're opposed to something than when you're for something. And that's a little bit unfortunate, but that's where you have to start. So we're opposed to bigger government. What are we for? That's where it gets a little more tricky. But again, issues like the balanced budget amendment, saying we're for lower taxes and less spending, that was able to sort of keep that broad movement together. But then I think where we went a little bit wrong, especially 2011 leading into 12, was where the movement became so popular, the brand became so strong that a lot of folks sort of glommed on and said, well, I'm a Tea Partier too, and now it's about this issue. And I think sometimes that divided people up, and then public opinion changed quite a bit when you combine that with the attacks from the media and from some on the left, and certainly some from the Republican side as well. So I think having a good policy set that's broad, having a message that's tailored is absolutely is key. Some of the other things we did in terms of stagecraft that I thought were smart on our part and were important, there was sort of that attack that we were sort of just the lowest common denominator of people out there. It was kind of a nasty attack, but we really tried to show our youthful energy. We tried to show that we had a diverse culture in the Tea Party movement. We tried to, so at the 9/12 March on Washington, for example, we didn't just do your typical patriotic music, which you do. It's always good to do some Lee Greenwood for sure, some Toby Keith. But we had some rappers up there. We did some hip hop. We did some other music that was not what they would, what the media and what others in the political class would expect. we tried to show a little bit edgier side. Our logo for the rally was actually a raised fist, very populist. Some would even say it comes out of a little bit of left-wing logos and images. So I think that was actually kind of powerful, though, because again, it kind of turned things on their head a little bit and made people think, well, what is this movement all about? And maybe this is something that that I could get involved in. One of the things we had to do too that was really important in terms of, every event we did, every rally, these charges are out there, people are looking for you to mess up. So we had to self-police the movement. And for students of IWP, we learned about agitprop, agitation propaganda, what the Soviets were really good at. Well, there's a group called, I guess they're the Lyndon LaRouche group, and they're very active in DC, and they're the ones that show up with either George Bush or Barack Obama as Hitler with the Hitler mustache. And they show up to every rally, and then they make everybody think that that big group of people supports that crazy ideology. Well, we had to really, we really had to take care of that, and we had to grab them and kind of kick them out. Now we are, adamant about free speech as any other thing, but as a private organization, having a private gathering on the steps of the Capitol, it was sort of like we either let them stay there, and then the media reports that, and a bunch of people stood out there with Barack Obama as Hitler signs, or we had to escort them out. And we did it in a way that, was very quiet, but you had to do that because there were plenty of bloggers and media folks who would come in, look for that, and they would take the pictures, and that would be what showed up on the news broadcast. And so that drove us crazy, but it was something we did a pretty good job trying to police. But also if someone came and had a sign that was inappropriate, we asked them to leave or take it down. And I know that there were plenty of times where infiltrators came in, probably from the left or maybe the establishment, right? But they would come in to make us look bad and hold up signs, and we would, boot them out. If you don't protect your brand, the movement can get damaged. And some of that did happen, certainly, but we did our best to sort of avoid that. Some of the other things, just thinking through what we learned here at IWP and some of the lessons, we talk a lot about propaganda, political warfare, psychological operations, diplomacy, and even public diplomacy. Some of this stuff actually applies pretty well to mass movements and domestic politics in addition to foreign policy. Let's take propaganda, for example. I talked a little bit about the logo and the images, but we thought about everything we did in terms of how it would be reported, because frankly the reporters, the bloggers would look at every little thing you do. And so, for example, when they started calling us the, we're a movement of the rich 1% elite, and anyone in the movement that I was involved with, if they wanted to do an event at a country club, I said, no way. We're going to Denny's. It was dive bars and Denny's, not the country club, because that stuff gets reported on every time. So the venue, the clothes that you wear, are we always kind of, suit and tie and button up, or could we wear jeans and t-shirts and be a little more youthful or edgy or a little bit more casual? We thought about those things, and it depended on what we were trying to achieve. Sometimes we wanted to look a little more professional. Other times we really didn't want that at all, depending on what we were doing. I mentioned music. Music can be a form of propaganda. It absolutely is. The words that you use, the type of music you play at your events, those sorts of things matter. And I think we definitely, that got reported in the media when they talked about the hip hop artists that were up there. And then they made music videos for the Tea Party movement. There was a documentary that was done about it that featured some of these guys. So I think that all of those things, you really have to think about what image are we trying to project, and what are people going to see when they see our imagery. So logos, clothes, words, music, food, venues, these can all be types of propaganda, and I mean that in the sense of a good type of propaganda if you do it well. Political warfare, this is a big part of what we did. This whole mass movement was, kind of built on the idea of political warfare. We had, the reality is we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of kind of paid people doing this. They tried to, the media and some on the left probably tried to pin this on the Koch brothers because they funded some organizations that were supportive, but 99% of the Tea Party activists out there in the movement were paying their own way to get on buses and come to Washington to rally. They were organizing locally. But we were able to do a lot in terms of political warfare on a very small budget. So for example, one of my favorite events we did was in Arkansas. Senator Blanche Lincoln was was there, and we were trying to get her to, actually she had just voted for Obamacare, so we were trying to go and make a public, show public disapproval of that. So we basically went to her district office, kind of did a flash mob, showed up with 150 people. We were very calm, very peaceful. We kind of just crashed into the office, called the media, had people, some people were calling saying, hey, by the way, I heard there's a bunch of people at Blanche Lincoln's office. So the media shows up, and then we're on the local news in Arkansas. She's hearing about it. The folks in D.C. are hearing about it, getting frantic calls about all the people in the office. We're all filling out cards, saying we're opposed to how you voted on Obamacare. And we created this, definitely got their attention. We got into the news media. We got in the newspapers. And so pretty good political warfare there, combined with, again, the psychological operations side of things, right? We were definitely in their heads, and it only took 150 people with a pretty well-coordinated effort. We got earned media, and then we had to translate that into, eventually, electoral politics. And so that was where this all came into play, too. With the mass movement of people, they're not always interested in getting involved in actual campaigns. That was a hurdle we had to overcome. But we were able to get those people that did events like that. We said, look, you've got to replace these people. That is the only answer if you're upset. And so we sort of turned that movement now toward electoral politics. And she actually was defeated soundingly, and we have new senators and a new senator in Arkansas.
12?
That was 2010.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And that happened all over the country. At the Utah Party Convention in Utah, we had a Republican Senator, Bob Bennett, that voted for the bailout, and we were able to get all sorts of people inside the delegate process from the local level and then at the state convention. And there were people with signs holding up, that said, "Remember TARP." And when he went down in that convention, basically took over the process, and when he went down, people started chanting "TARP, TARP, TARP," and so that symbol of that vote really hurt a lot of incumbents. So the movement was gathering strength, and we made a huge impact again in 2010. We won 63 House seats and 6 Senate seats. Now, depending on your perspective, we either made an alliance with the Republican Party, we joined the Republican Party, or we infiltrated the Republican Party, or they took us over. No one really knows what happened. Maybe a combination of all those things. But it was a successful year, and the movement, I would argue, is still very strong to this day. If you look at Texas, for example, more than 60% of Republicans in Texas self-identify as Tea Party members. So in a lot of ways, the revolution has been institutionalized. And I think that's a good thing. It was an outside force, a mass movement that now is very much involved in the political process. So, again, we use different tools of statecraft and strategic communications, political warfare. Diplomacy is another one, building relationships with people and gathering a little bit of intelligence about how they were thinking, whether they were journalists or elected officials or staffers. And that was sort of the kind face, and you're kind of apologizing for the crazy guys outside protesting. Look, I'm just here. I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. It was a great way to send someone in and be the diplomat and sort of figure out what they were thinking. But you had that group of people outside to kind of put the pressure on elected officials. So it was a very successful movement. Again, I think that probably the most telling sign of success, and there's been ups and downs in this movement like every movement, but the most telling sign of success is that out of the folks that are running for president on the Republican side, a number of them got their start sort of in the Tea Party movement or have Tea Party support, including Ted Cruz in Texas, Senator Cruz, Senator Rand Paul in Kentucky, Governor Scott Walker, Senator Marco Rubio. So there's quite a few that will benefit probably from the energy created by this movement. And I don't want to put all of our cards into the presidential race. I think that actually the most important thing happening around the country is in the local level. And I guess that's another sort of thing to kind of end on here, is that to be more effective, to be the most effective, you should do it at the local level. The amount of impact that we've had and that you can have at city council races and city council meetings, at the school board level, the county commissioners' courts, mayors, and building that farm team that then becomes state reps and state senators and eventually congressmen. That's how this movement or any political movement will have the most success, when you get involved at the local level. However, we could end up with a Tea Party president in the next cycle, so we'll see what happens. So thank you guys, and with that I'll take any questions or comments.
Could you talk about your technology strategy?
Sure, great question. And I'd like to also, I haven't talked much about Senator Cornyn's re-election in 2014, but there's a lot we did there in the technological side as well that I think will be helpful. So the Tea Party movement actually started on Twitter, Facebook, and a conference call. Rick Santelli on CNBC went on a rant live on television, and he was talking about how upset he was and how the founding fathers would be rolling in their graves if they knew what we were doing as a country. So that probably would have been seen by 37 people.
Who's Rick Santelli?
Sorry, Rick Santelli is a reporter for CNBC, and he was reporting from the Chicago Board of Mercantile Exchange. And you know, there's kind of an elite audience that watches CNBC, but if not for YouTube, that speech would not have been seen by more than those 37 people. But because of YouTube, it was seen by 1 million people within 24 hours. And literally what happened was a group of people, you know, that video went viral, as they say. It got emailed around, posted on Facebook. Twitter was pretty brand new at that time. And people just started talking about how great it was that he went on this rant. And at the time, again, we're sitting in our office hearing from people this outrage about what's going on in the country. Santelli goes on the rant. So we spring into action, and there's just sort of it's a natural, spontaneous movement of people who join a Facebook group that's called, you know, Stand with Rick Santelli or something like that. And from that, there were conversations that started, and then it moved over to Twitter. So people were having conversations saying, yeah, we stand with Rick Santelli, and maybe we should do a Tea Party, because in his rant he talks about, you know, we should have, it's time for another Boston Tea Party. Maybe we'll do it in Lake Michigan this time. And we'll dump, We'll dump derivatives into the Lake Michigan. And so the movement began on Facebook and Twitter. And then after these conversations, this is 2009, February 19th and 20th of 2009, within 48 hours of that happening, there's a few thousand people probably, well, maybe even a few hundred in those conversations. And someone suggests, hey, let's do a conference call. And then someone goes to freeconferencecall.com and gets a number, and then we all call in. I think there was only maybe actually 100 people or so, maybe less, that participated in that. And then we have this conversation about what would a Tea Party protest look like? Where should we do it? Let's do it in Chicago in July. And then when someone says, why wait? Let's do it next Friday. So February 27th, we have the first round of protests, which became known as the Tea Party. And they were in 50 cities across the country. That could not have happened without the internet. It could not have happened without email, Facebook, and Twitter.
Was it spontaneous, or how was it leveraged?
So it was spontaneous, that initial sort of reaction to Santelli. He was spontaneous, that initial sort of community being built around him of a couple hundred people was. And then it became organized. That first week, essentially, we all, we got on the phone. We kind of developed a how-to that was kind of a blog post, how to have your own tea parties, sent it out, and then people kind of did their own thing. It was mostly in urban areas, mostly young people, young professionals, and so the first protests were actually in places like Washington and Dallas and Santa Monica and Tampa and Houston and urban areas. And there were probably only maybe 10,000 people that showed up across the country. But then when that happened, we all decided, hey, let's have another round on April 15th, tax day, and see if we can't grow this thing. We felt the momentum that day. We knew that there was something real. And so again, using Facebook, using a website, taxdayteaparty.com, just communicating in that way, the Tea Party was crowdsourced. And what I mean by that is someone would literally go to the website and contact us and say, hey, I'm in Baltimore, and I don't see a Tea Party protest listed for tax day. And we'd say, well, guess what? Now you're in charge. And we'll resource you, and we'll provide you with ideas and help you get the permit and all those things. And then all of a sudden we had somebody in Baltimore who had their phone number and their email listed. And then people would come to that site and they would say, hey, I want to RSVP for this, and we'd have a critical mass of 200 people or 300 people, and it just kept growing. And then we had, Google Maps is still, I guess, relatively new at the time, but we had a Google Maps set up where then you could actually just look on the map anywhere in the country and find the closest Tea Party to you.
Do you have metrics and a timeline? What I'm getting is, I happened to watch that interview. So
okay.
Day one, he says what he says on CNBC. Is there any tracking data in terms of how quickly it spread through YouTube, and at what point did, I'm presuming FreedomWorks, got involved in it. In other words, you know, if you track it on a daily basis, how many thousands or tens of thousands on a given day, and then to what extent were you able to leverage it and then measure that, or is it all more serendipitous?
Combination of both. The truth is, you know, we were calling on people to take to the streets and protest bailouts and stimulus even a few days before this rant, and I think maybe one guy showed up in Florida with the sign, you know, but conservatives and libertarians are not really used to protesting, and so we were actually sitting there saying, this is a way to show your displeasure at what's going on around the country. And so we sent out a newsletter probably, and it's you know, you can find it, it's probably early February, you know, when that happened. But there were a handful of small little protests that happened. And so we were very much following this, and actually a blogger, Michelle Malkin, tracked those individual events that happened around the country. So we saw that happen. Then Santelli goes on the rant. And that's when we actually got organized. But so those little protests were sort of happening, but there was no real, I mean, he kind of threw the gas on the fire, and there was no real organization, I think, until he did that. In terms of tracking, you know, I don't know that I kept track of that or anyone did. You might be able to get some information from YouTube itself if they do that, or to look at Google Analytics or something like that. Someone might be able to help with that. But I'll just tell you, from February to April 15th, it just grew like this. And you know, so we actually collected thousands of email addresses, and I mean, every day I was on the phone talking to people, emailing, responding. My wife can attest. We were on a date one time, and
step in.
uh-oh.
So, just to tell you the momentum of this, so he's talking about February 2009. By February 2010, Valentine's Day, which is why I remember it, we were at dinner for Valentine's Day, and he's on the phone with the New York Times. And I remember being sort of the grumpy, frustrated girlfriend about Valentine's Day. But I remember talking to Brendan and him saying, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Do you realize that this movement that's happening right now is so unique, that this is a time in history that's going to be, we're going to be talking about this for years to come. We're building something. And I think that even at that point, it was still the momentum and the energy for this movement 1 year later in 2010 was still very relative and still happening, still growing.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to say something, and the vocabulary isn't necessarily as precise, but do you see the brand as being somewhat time limited? And what I mean is that it was defined with reference to TARP and the bailout, and really was a symbol of other deeper issues relating to the lack of fiscal accountability and fiscal measures here in DC. And ultimately it morphs into other campaigns, other activities. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what I'm really trying to say is, does the brand end up as the focus, or does the focus need to shift to the issues, the underlying issues that you were trying to address? And where are those now, I guess? Yeah,
that's a great question. And I think that the reality is that the focus probably is more on the issues. The focus probably is more on, you know, the battles of today than the battles of 2008 and 2009. Now we still have this huge debt problem, right? We still have all sorts of problems on the spending side. But again, I used this phrase earlier, but you know, we were an outside force. It sort of institutionalized itself mostly within the Republican Party. Now certainly some people are outside, but there are, you know, dozens of sort of Tea Party congressmen who are here and Tea Party senators and folks that are running for president. But yeah, I think the focus, I mean, if you talk to people today, if you look at the numbers that I've seen, you know, depending on the state, anywhere from, you know, 30 to 70% of a Republican Party in any state is self-identified Tea Party. And a lot of those people were not involved at all before. Now they are. I think the challenge is, I think the brand actually matters a little less. To get to your point on that, the brand matters a little less than it did back then when we were sort of building this mass movement and trying to get people involved and engaged and plugged in. Now it is actually more about, hey, if you believe in fiscal responsibility, if you believe in certain ideas, we want you to be involved and take action. So from, you know, and in Texas, I mean, our state legislature, the battle really is between sort of the Tea Party wing of the party and the more, you know, moderate wing of the party.
Very neutral in explaining this, but the perception is that Boehner had initially structured a deal with Obama on fiscal matters. And the reporting is that the left wing immediately undermined Obama and said, no way. But yet Boehner got, and the conservatives in the House got blamed for the breakdown that led to the shutdown. And I'm just curious, on a larger level, how an outside group, not just FreedomWorks, but any outside advocacy group, does or doesn't put its own priorities ahead of consensus for, and I'm not necessarily saying consensus, you know, I just got off the board of the Historical Society in Capitol, and I talk a lot about compromise in politics. But my point is, okay, let's go back to the 1850s. Slavery's the issue. Okay, how are we going to compromise? You know, who's a slave, who's free? And so my point is, when I say consensus, I mean resolution, not necessarily a point of view.
Yeah, so I think the job of a Cato Institute or a FreedomWorks or a Heritage Foundation, an outside group, the Club for Growth that gets involved in politics, I think their job is to fight for what they believe in and to hold their ground and say, this is what we believe and this is what we think you ought to do, and yes, we're going to put out our scorecard and that sort of thing. And I think that they owe that to themselves and their donors and the cause, because to them, you know, and I can tell you just that mentality is, well, if we compromise, you know, to the extent we compromise, like our country's already going way toward more spending and more government, right? So our compromise would be, if we start out halfway, if we start out here and give you half, we're already losing so much. That's their position. Now, if you're a senator, if you're a congressman, it's a little different. You know, you represent, you know, there's theories of representation, right? Do you elect a congressman and then say, do the best job that you can and vote your conscience? Do you say, we're going to elect you and we want you to do what the majority of the district says? Do you say, we want you to represent, I mean, there's so many different theories of what they should do. At the end of the day, this is why democracy and representative government is a mess, but I think it's a good thing, it's a healthy thing. And so I think it's the job of everybody to fight, you know, to fight for what they believe in. And for me, you know, I'm probably not going to compromise as much as the next guy if I'm in there. But I understand sort of the calculation on why they might do that, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. If we could move away from ideology a little bit and go more toward your involvement, you know, in building this movement. You talked about how the movement, you know, sort of grew through the, you know, Rick Centelli rant and onward. I was curious a little bit more about like how you directly, you know, got involved in managing it. You're part of it. You know, and then to go from that, you know, like, did you know, was it an amateur who started up the Facebook page and the Twitter feed and the conference call, or, you know, did a professional have a hand in things?
Sure.
So starting with that historical aspect, but then broadening it just a little bit, to what extent would you recommend building a movement yourself, you know, versus harnessing a movement, you know, right in a way that's already out there?
It's a lot less work to just harness it.
Yeah.
It's way too much work to try and spark and build, and you can't, so many things have to come together. So there's actually a really good book by Kate Zernicki, who's a New York Times reporter. It's called Boiling Mad, Inside Tea Party America, and it actually chronicles a lot of the things that I did and that others did to kind of launch the movement. There's a chapter on everything, and I'll try and get everything, you know, as right as she got it, because I was probably, you know, I told her the same thing, but no, I think that it was a combination of things. So truly the mood and the kind of disposition of the country was there. It was real, it was spontaneous, it was a reaction to what was happening in Washington. And so one thing I didn't mention earlier is when the bailout happened and then the stimulus, I mean, the switchboards just lit up. And nobody was orchestrating this. People were calling, watching on, you know, CNN or Fox saying, this is about to happen, they're going to vote on this bailout. And people just lit up the switchboards. And so, of course, we knew that.
Which switchboards?
The Capitol switchboards. So every congressman and senator, whether directly getting calls or coming in through the main switchboard and getting patched through, they were just It was crazy. But because we had a petition up, we launched a petition on the bailout called NoWallStreetBailout.com. And again, this is kind of the fall of '08. But because we had that petition up, people were finding it. We were doing ads, you know, and talking about it and doing media and talking about it. And so people found the petition, signed it. We had our phone number there and everything. We had their email. So we were quickly sending out newsletters and telling people, call your congressman, kind of to add to the cacophony of voices on Capitol Hill. And so then people started calling our office as well. And again, spontaneous, but just sort of, what can I do? What can I do? I can't get through. And so I would literally put them on hold, patch them through. Hopefully they would get through. But then we said, now call the district offices because those are probably not as jammed. So then folks focused on that. But most of that stuff, that was very much just spontaneous. It happened. But we saw that it was sort of, to me, it was almost like as a grassroots organizer, it was sort of like a dream, you know? Oh my God, people who care about what I care about are now calling me saying, what can I do to help? This is what I had done for the previous 3 or 4 years when there was crickets on the other end because people just weren't motivated yet. So now they're motivated and they're doing that. But again, to get into your question, so the rant he did was spontaneous. The Facebook group literally, I don't know who started it. You could probably find out. It probably still exists. But somebody posted it, and of course, as Facebook goes, it shows up in everybody's news feeds, and it grew tremendously. The folks on Twitter were a combination, I think, of some who are more professional types like myself who were involved in a think tank or a grassroots group, but then also just regular folks, probably a good mix. And then I just saw the need to write something, you know, a top 10 kind of easy steps to throw a tea party, and I typed it out after the night of the rant. I sent it out to a couple of bloggers. Michelle Malkin was one, and Glenn Reynolds was another at Instapundit. They both posted that blog post, like, hey, here's a nifty guide. So that was more on the professional side. But again, the people that actually self-identified and found that and said, I want to do something, I mean, they were just people who, you know, went online and found it. And so I was getting hundreds of emails from people saying, thanks for that advice, thanks for that blog post. Can you help me? I need help getting, how do I do this? You know, and so we were taking them step by step. So I guess the answer...
So you got that submitted on multiple blogs?
On a couple of blogs, yep. And again, the organizers though, the local organizers, whether it was the 50 that happened in February or so, and the 750 that happened on April 15th, I mean, that was 90% kind of, you know, unpaid local people who said, I want to help, I want to do something. And actually, the reason it was so widespread is because, you know, we were sort of encouraging people to have big rallies in major media markets, right? So Houston and Dallas and, you know, DC and New York and Philly. But then people were saying, I don't want to drive over there. I want to have one in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I want to have one in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Okay, great. Now you're in charge. And so some of it was more of, I hate to use the word kind of facilitator, but that's really more what it was than at that point even just, you know, organizing. It was a lot of responding to people saying, here are the tools you need. Now the September 12th event, you know, again, I saw a million people showing up in their local communities across the country, and I said to my bosses, I think we could probably bring a lot of people to DC. So I went and got the permit for the 9/12 march, and we spent a decent amount of money organizing it, paying for the porta potties, you know, some of the costs that you had to incur from that. But in terms of the people that came, they paid their own way. Again, 99% of the people paid their own way on trains, planes, and automobiles to get here. I mean, it was phenomenal. So, yeah, there was the organization within, you know, DC to make sure that we had the proper permitting, that we had a plan, that we had enough, you know, things that were required. But all the local activity to get people from, you know, Atlanta or from Hawaii or from Alaska, from Montana, that all happened at the local level, and we just sort of supported it. And again, I use that term, you know, crowdsourced, or I mean, so the information, you know, was a mix of people telling us things, and we were telling them things about, here's what time we're starting, the march is going to gather at Freedom Plaza, but it was up to you. You know, we may provide a metro map, but it was really up to you where you stay, you know, and how you get there. But imagine that, a bunch of individualists end up finding their own way to the same place at the same time. And there's actually a great time-lapse video of this, of everybody gathering at Freedom Plaza, and then you can just see the march building and then expanding, and it went for 3.5 hours, and there's a camera from the top that kind of, you know, showed that footage. It was fantastic. But I hope that answers your question. It really was a mix of kind of good strategy and organizing with something real. We could not have orchestrated this, right, if we wanted to. I mean, if I could, I would have done it, right? I mean, it was my dream come true to see this movement happen, but there would not have been a movement, and it would not have been successful, and it would not have turned into a huge electoral success without some organization and professionals to say, don't go tilting at windmills over here on this congressional race, get involved in this one, because it's a swing district and we can beat them. And so those sorts of things people really, really took to heart, and I think without that, it probably would have gone in all sorts of different directions.
So there were a few like key strategic steps.
Sure.
Right, the blog posting, the 9/12 march, the No Wall Street Bailout.com.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, beyond those key strategic steps, it was more scalable software to
absolutely.
Events,
yeah, open. Yeah.
And
Google Maps, Twitter, Facebook, email, phone, real person-to-person interaction, and there was a lot of guidance and a lot of tools. A lot of strategic advice. I spent a lot, as my wife knows, a lot of time on the phone, at the gym, you know, talking to people, giving advice, and others did too. And, you know, you basically, again, you can't, it's almost like I come from that Austrian school of economics where I don't believe that a bunch of planners can plan the economy. How could I, you know, plan all these things happening? But what I can do is I can support and I can kind of give some help and then get out of the way. But it was just beautiful chaos, and it led to a huge local-based movement that made a huge impact.
And I mean, helping amateurs, you know, with like permits in 750 jurisdictions.
Well, not all of them needed that help, but yeah, but many did. Probably, maybe, you know, only 50 or something like that maybe needed help with permits. But on the media side, we would help. We would promote what they were doing. They would send the details. Hey, we're going to meet at the state capitol in Jefferson City, Missouri at noon. And we would post it and then send out a newsletter to all of our members. And other groups did the same thing, to where somebody took the leadership side and then everyone just sort of, you know, moved in the same direction. But I mean, I loved it when I got to the point where I would travel around the country and it had become more organized, where we would just show up. And these guys, one of my favorite groups is in the Cincinnati area, and they were just so organized. They had committees set up, they had local funding, they had everything going. And we showed up and provided some training and advice and things like that. But at that point, it was like, you know, it was sort of like, you know, teaching someone how to ride a bike, and the training wheels are off, and they're riding a lot faster than we ever could.
Mm-hmm. So you would coordinate with your members, and you would get in touch with the local media for them. Often.
Yeah, or tell them to do that. Sometimes I'd pick up the phone and say, hey, there's a really good group that you should know about, the Cincinnati Enquirer, and I would connect them. Other times I would just say, hey, you should call so-and-so at the New York Times and interview with them. And a lot of that was strategic too, because frankly, we wanted to make sure that those who were interviewing with the New York Times or those that we put on Fox were going to be a great messenger.
Right. Good representative of the movement.
And you had no control over those that were bad messengers or who said things that got you in trouble.
Yeah. And then did you do, you know, you got in touch with your members, but did you also try to get in touch with people who hadn't opted in?
Absolutely,
yeah. Contacted you directly?
Absolutely. So
get in touch with other lists from other organizations. I don't know.
Some of that.
Parties or.
And a lot of the stuff was, you know, people posted their event and then their contact information for tax day, and that's a lot of how we would go in and get the information, follow up, and then we'd offer things of value, right? So we would say, would you like help with this, or this? We did a lot of training, so a lot of teaching people how to campaign, how to back the candidate of your choice, and again. Workshops, yeah. And so you empower people to get involved. And that was very powerful. And again, you know, we couldn't be on the ground everywhere, and we couldn't be, you know, I had to kind of learn this the hard way too, because I couldn't scale the model of I'm going to come parachute into Ohio and I'm going to be there for 6 weeks or longer. I have to be in Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, Texas, and everywhere else. And so we would go in, do training, provide support. We would produce materials like yard signs and door hangers and things like that they could use. And then it was amazing. You would ship 1,000 yard signs to one person who was the head of the group, and they would divide them up by hundreds, and then those people would divide them up by tens, and all of a sudden they just show up and cover the entire state of Indiana or wherever.
What did you do to make sure that it stuck? That it wasn't just a one-day training, one-day event, and then it dissipated? There was
always a forward-thinking, a future-focused message, right? So at first it was like, okay, we're going to gather February 27th. It was just very random and chaotic, and then it became, okay, we have permits now on April 15th, and that's the next thing. And then we discussed, do we do July 4th? And there were some July 4th events as well. And we always were looking forward to something. Then it was September 12th, and that was a big kind of coming out of the Tea Party movement. And then we said, a really important strategic moment was when all of the folks that were involved in this said, we need to be involved in electoral politics. And it was not a foregone conclusion that these activists were going to get involved for any candidate. They were mad at both parties. They weren't ready for that. But we said, hey, well, this guy Scott Brown's running for Senate in Massachusetts. It's a long shot, but there's a seat. Would you go? And a lot of people went and knocked on doors and made calls. He raised $1 million a day on the internet for like 5 days in a row. I mean, that was all from this excitement and this energy, this crowdsourced funding. And so that was the first big victory. And then what we did is we nationalized every race after that in a primary. What I mean by that is Utah's convention process was like March, April of 2010. Well, we had people from all over the country, giving to Mike Lee and making phone calls for Mike Lee and posting things on Facebook. And so we went state by state with a national movement and used overwhelming force at the weakest point, little Sun Tzu, and it was just one thing after another. So then you get all these primary victories. Now we have our candidates, and we go into the general. And that was the strength. We did that for Ted Cruz as well. We nationalized that race and brought in all these other guys from 2010, like Rand Paul, for example, to come campaign for him.
So for each of the little, spontaneous, chaotic, amateur uprisings, you would put together a local timeline of future events moving forward.
Sometimes.
Sign-up sheets
Yeah.
to get their contact information
Sure.
to stay in touch.
And a lot of times they would come to us and demand, Brendan, you got to get involved in this race. We want your help. And they already had an organization in Indiana. They had me come to their gathering. It was a state convention, and it was so organized by congressional district, by county, by everything. And I kind of came and talked principles about how to do this. And they're like, we want to take down Dick Lugar, our sitting U.S. Senator. And I said, okay, well, that's a pretty tough fight, but it looks like you guys are on your way. And so we sort of worked with them, but they came to us and kind of told us, we need this from you, and we need that from you, and you need to come back, and you need to send Dick Armey to come give a speech. And we responded to the market. We responded to their demands as best as we could and gave them the best advice that we could. Now, sometimes they listened and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes we were right and sometimes they were right and we were wrong. And so you just sort of had that relationship. It was bottom up, but it also had a certain level of, pushing from the top saying, trust me. It's sort of like you go to the mechanic and he tells you it's going to cost a lot of money, and you kind of argue with him, and he's like, hey, I'm the mechanic, you're paying me to do this, let me help you. So there is that kind of meeting each other halfway.
Yeah, and going back and forth and, with
Sure.
both directions with so many different groups.
And to make my Austrian economics point again, the local knowledge, I could not have the local knowledge about White County, Indiana that the White County Tea Party had, and they came to me and said, in White County, this is what we need to win, this is what we need you to do. And in Indiana, just as a whole, here's what we need. Here's the, people don't really like when you beat up on their senior statesmen, so we have to be very positive. Those types of things are local, that's local knowledge. I can't know that about every county in the country. So they would educate us and say, this is how we have to approach it, but we need your time, your money, your expertise, your training, and all the other advice that you have. Well, thank you guys.